Welcome, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this exciting workshop on sport and youth engagement in turbulent times. My name is Ben Sanders, and I'm a senior consultant at the International Platform on Sport and Development, sportanddev.org, which is a leading global platform for those in sport for development. And I'm coming to you direct from Cape Town, South Africa. I'm honored to facilitate this panel and wanted to recognize the great work of the Generation Amazing team for putting this festival together at a critical time across the globe. It has never been more important to debate and deliberate the value and viability of sport and development, including in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this webinar is dedicated to all the young people across continents, cultures, and contexts that are working tirelessly every day, often with little reward, using sport to empower themselves and others. These are true heroes, and they deserve our recognition for being on the front lines. Today is also the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and it's important that we strengthen efforts to make sport more inclusive and ensure that no one is left behind, including all levels of ability. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has profoundly affected sport for development programs and the ways in which young people can engage meaningfully and safely. There's an urgent need to share tools, resources, and best practices which organizations and individuals, including youth themselves, can use to empower young people during a time in which they're often increasingly vulnerable and disconnected. So this workshop brings together 3 inspiring young people from 3 different youth networks who will discuss how young people can stay connected through sport during and beyond the COVID pandemic. So I'm delighted to introduce our panelists to you. First of all, we have Maggie Brennan. She's a member of the Commonwealth Youth Sport for Development and Peace Network, representing Canada. And she is the Senior Coordinator of Games Operation and Delivery at the Canadian Paralympic Committee. She leads the planning and operational delivery of key games programming for Team Canada for the Pan American and Paralympic Games. She is also an International Olympic Committee young leader and a former high-performance ice hockey athlete who joins us from Ottawa, Canada. Welcome, Maggie. Secondly, we have Warren Lucas. Warren is chair of the Youth Network for the Foundation for Sport Development and Peace. He is pursuing a PhD in exercise science at the University of Cape Town, designing patient-centered exercise interventions in substance use treatment settings. He works as a scientist at SA Medical Research Council, is National Academic and Operations Manager at the International Fitness Academy, Director of the Faculty of Exercise Science, and a mentor to young and aspiring fitness professionals. He serves as the President and Chairperson of the Cape Town Gymnastics Association. Warren joins us from Cape Town, South Africa. Welcome, Warren. And last, but certainly not least, Ishita Godinho is a member of the UNESCO Youth and Sport Task Force. She currently works with an NGO in India that uses sport to raise awareness and further inspire action on relevant social issues. She is an active member of the UNESCO Youth and Sport Task Force and is passionate about education, empowerment, gender equality, and sustainable development practice. She believes that small acts, when multiplied, can change the world. Ishita joins us from Goa, India. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to our 3 panelists from across the globe, South Africa, Canada, and India, across time zones, cultures, and contexts. We're going to get into this straight away. I'm going to be posing a series of questions to the panelists to facilitate a live discussion. We encourage members of the audience to get involved, so please post your comments or questions in the chat, and we will get to them later on as we go through it. So, first question to our panelists. Could each of you please tell us a little bit about your organization and your involvement in sport and development in just 2 minutes? If you could kick off Ishita, followed by Warren and Maggie, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for that introduction, and it's an honor to be here with Maggie and Warren as well. I'm here today representing the UNESCO Youth and Task Force organization, and I also work with the Forza Goa Foundation that uses football as a tool for development. To give you a quick brief, I'm aware of the time, about the UNESCO Task Force. It's basically, there are 60 members from Asia Pacific. all actively working in the area of sports for development. We have individuals working in conflict areas. We have individuals working with children with special needs, and basically youth from across the Asia Pacific network who use sports to create some sort of change in their immediate communities. And we stay connected and share best practices with each other. Recently, during the pandemic, they even launched a grant, and all of us had to sort of come up with project proposals for it. So it's a great network that facilitates environment to work on sports projects.
Yeah, that's exciting, and I'm aware of the Youth and Sport Task Force. Great network. Warren, over to you quickly.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, everybody. It is also a great honor for me to be here with you all and to be co-presenting and talking with you, Ben, and Ishita and Maggie. Greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. Ben, I think you're probably around the corner from me here somewhere. So the Youth Network for Sport Development and Peace is a child of the Foundation for Sport Development and Peace. We were born from our first African Youth Forum, which took place on Robben Island. We spent about a week there. And we realized while we were facilitating fitness and physical activity and sport development programs that the youth within sport development and peace lack their voices to be heard. So that's how the Youth Network for Sport Development and Peace was born. So what we do, we create programs for the youth, of the youth, and to the youth. And we make sure that we can help facilitate partnerships, collaborations, and monitor and evaluate some programs that we come up with as well. So yeah, that's us.
Thanks, Warren. And yeah, been great to see the birth of this network and your leadership in it. It's come a long way. Great. Over to you, Maggie, and your experience from the other side of the globe in the reasonably early morning in Canada.
Reasonably early morning. No, thanks again for the introduction, Ben. And yeah, so I'm here today from Ottawa, Canada, and I'm representing the Commonwealth Youth Sport for Development and Peace Network, which is a bit of a mouthful, so I'll probably refer to it for the CYSDP for the rest of the session. But this was a network that was established in May of 2018, and it's supported by the Commonwealth Secretariat. And it's part of their commitment to put young people at the center of sustainable development. So the Commonwealth is made up of 54 independent countries, and it's home to 2.4 billion people. And what population of this is youth people is actually 65%. So 1.5 billion people of the Commonwealth are under the age of 30. The CYSDP is a platform for young leaders from around the Commonwealth with expertise and interest in employing sport as a tool to contribute to development issues. So our mission is to increase the representation of youth in sport for development through advocacy, education, and demonstration of power to policymakers in the Commonwealth. And so kind of to the second part of Ben's question around what's my involvement in sport for development and why am I on this network is, as he mentioned, I work for the Canadian Paralympic Committee, and he also touched on, International Day of Persons with a Disability. So we're big advocates there for accessibility and inclusion in sport. I'm a player, but now I'm a coach. So I coach women and girls ice hockey in Canada for ages 15 to 18. And I look forward to sharing with you a little bit later on what that's been like in the global pandemic. And then lastly, I'm a member of the International Olympic Committee Young Leader Program, and I advocate for their mission of building a better world through sport, particularly by running a youth empowerment program here in Canada, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But that's kind of my involvement in role here today.
Great, thanks Maggie, thanks Ishita, thanks Warren. I mean, an inspiring trio of individuals doing some really great work across the world. Maggie touched on a really important point there. I mean, the youth demographic is growing in the regions you guys are working in. We know in South Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, we know in most of the Commonwealth countries, as well as in India and that region. So voices of young people are more important than ever, especially in sport for development and peace, and in line, obviously, with the SDG agenda, 2030 agenda of leaving no one behind. So what I'm going to ask now, we've obviously had an unprecedented year, 2020, and the current pandemic has affected, virtually all aspects of our lives, including the organization of sport, physical activity and development. So could you please elaborate just on how COVID-19 has affected your work, firstly, and how you responded to some of these challenges, and even if there have been any opportunities during this challenging time? We'll kick off with Maggie, and then Ishita and Warren. So back to you, Maggie.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Ben, and the answer really is, has it not impacted everything that we do? Right? Yeah. So, as it relates to the activities of the CYSDP, because we're made up of individuals from all over the Commonwealth, communications with each other have always been primarily virtual. So from that aspect, we've been able to continue on that front. But certainly our focus has shifted from, providing insight and expertise and recommendation, a bit more overarching, to very specifically using sport for development during this time to address it. So, we've been doing things around different workshops and, sharing tools and different things of how we can keep people active and healthy during this time, based on all the things that are impacted by COVID. And so, and again, it certainly slowed down some of the things we were hoping to be able to have some influence and some impact in. And so a good example is the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting was set to be hosted last year in Rwanda, who is the newest member of the Commonwealth, and that was postponed, and we were going to play a role in that. So, there's certainly been some shift on some of the maybe things we thought we were going to be able to influence and have an impact on, to the really the impacts of the pandemic. So that's kind of on that front. And then with my work at the Canadian Paralympic Committee, I think very clearly the biggest impact to us was the postponement of the games. But, as you mentioned, in terms of opportunity, our response to this has really just been looking at it as though we've been given the gift of time. So, we've been using it to work to improve our programming and innovate and set our team up as best as possible for, I think, what we all know is likely still going to be a relatively unordinary games next year. And then the biggest one for me, as it relates to my coaching, has been really mostly affected in coaching youth. And so I think a lot of the things we know about sport and its benefits have been taken away. So as an example, we can't really gather as a team to get to know each other. There's no games, no tournaments, and we're very limited in what we're allowed to teach and what we're allowed to do. So it's certainly been challenging to keep it fun and motivating for the kids, but really how we've had to address this is keep it creative. We've been integrating different games that aren't necessarily even applicable to our sport, but keeping it fun. We created the COVID Cup, which is a trophy that we give out once a month. We split the teams up in half and have them compete against each other. And I think for me as a coach, what's been the most encouraging is the kids' commitment, regardless of how tough it's been. They continue to show up and work hard through all the challenges and the impacts of COVID in our community here. And it's really refreshing to see their resilience, and it's pretty inspiring. So that's a little bit about what it's been like for me over the last 8 months in some of my activities.
Thanks, Maggie. And I mean, it's certainly been a challenge. And as you say, how could this not have impacted the way we work? And but inspiring to see how many young people have kept going during this time, as you said, have remained motivated, have engaged in alternative ways, and that's really great. I mean, we've seen a lot of online resources created during this time on Sport and Dev. We've got a list of sort of COVID-19 resources sports organizations have created. Organizations have been hosting events virtually, like this event. Warren, you hosted a conference virtually earlier, and I know people are really mobilizing to do what we can. But I think it's also quite clear that the value of sport and in-person interaction, something that maybe we took for granted, is made quite clear in its absence at times. Over to you, Ishita, your challenges perhaps, or your responses in your work to the pandemic and its associated challenges.
Thank you, Ben. So I think I'd like to divide the last 8 months into the first 4 months of the pandemic striking, and then the last 4 months. So the first 4 months were really difficult in India when the lockdown was announced, because India has a great population that is poor and lesser privileged, right? And we had a situation where people were struggling even to get essential services because they couldn't leave their house, or they didn't have any money saved, and they were losing their jobs. So that is when we stepped in to provide essential services to people. We stopped all our work. Many of our coaches who work with us in our organizations were helping with packing essential supplies like rice and lentils and things like that. And it's not just me. Across our youth network in a few developing countries, we realized that many sports organizations were doing similar work. And that's when we realized that maybe we are about football or ice skating or basketball, but when the world needs us, everybody came together for this cause. And during this time, we also provided a lot of mental health support. We do work with an organization that talks to children and people from our organization about mental health. And we ensure that at this time, help was made available easily to people going through a certain mental health crisis. So for the first 4 months, we focused on these two essential things, which was getting food to people and making sure that people are okay mentally. And then the next 4 months, we developed an online curriculum to keep children engaged, especially because, again, a lot of our children come from lesser privileged families where they don't have the most conducive environments at home. You know, they don't have an iPod or a PS4 to play games. So we came up with this online program where our coaches would send them videos through WhatsApp, and they would watch it and then make a video and send it back to us. And we just wanted to do this to keep them engaged and stay in touch with them, because just imagine for a child who spends 8 to 10 hours of their day outside the home to be locked up at home, it's definitely going to take a toll on their physical health and mental health. And along with these videos of football training, we also send them videos on nutrition and gender equality and waste management, just to keep them engaged and excited and also teach them something. And we made these WhatsApp groups where we kept interacting with them. So I think that's how we've been dealing with the pandemic, making sure that children are staying safe, but making sure they're still engaged and involved.
Ishita, and yeah, imagine the challenges you face in India. South Africa is a developing country, obviously similar but different set of challenges. But we have seen many sport for development organizations actually having to step into the front lines with distribution of food, health equipment, and playing a role, actually, a prominent role in the COVID response, given the need for this, both in relief efforts, but then I guess in the broader recovery and response efforts, which is really important. And I'm sure in India that need is very pronounced. So that's fantastic work. Warren, your perspective on the challenges and the responses that you've had to go through.
That's a very good question, because the challenges seem insurmountable. It's almost like I cannot count them. But I can list a few of how COVID specifically shifted sport here in South Africa. I cannot speak on behalf of all the sports particularly, but I know that there are a lot of codes that needed to slow down and then not have any competitions at all because we were all under lockdown. And as a result, a lot of the federations lost their income from competition and tournament entry fees. And as a result, these federations couldn't support their clubs, and their clubs, some of them have unfortunately needed to close down because they couldn't provide the space for the youth or their participants to recreate, to play sport, and to engage in physical activity. So that was one of the big, obvious COVID-related problems that has happened in the world of sport. Though COVID did bring an opportunity for the sector of youth and sport development and peace. A lot of the time, we always forget our stance on how we have an advantage with technology. So that's brought some kind of unity, albeit separate or socially distant unity. It's some kind of unity that has been able to take place. So we've seen unique adaptations within sport to keep going. We've seen some clubs and some federations piloting Zoom sport. I really think that they probably need to add that into a textbook because it's a way of life now. And this is one way that COVID affected work, because while some coaches in some federations were not able to continue working, other coaches needed to become a little bit more innovative and take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution and use technology to the best of their ability. The problem here, though, was that this, the gap between those that have and those that do not have is already obvious, but now with COVID, it became blatantly obvious. So those that had access to technology and internet and Wi-Fi and devices, they were privileged enough to still have received some kind of sport-related services, while those who definitely need our services the most were unable to recreate and be physically active because they were out of touch with their coaches, out of touch with their clubs, and out of touch with their community centers. So those are some of the problems that COVID has affected us here in South Africa where sport is concerned, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. And yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying. You know, at Sport and Dev, we did a call for articles earlier this year on the future of sport and development, and asked a few questions around sport. Is it time for sport to change? What can sport do better to serve society? And I think it's quite clear that the COVID pandemic has exposed a lot of the fault lines in our society, and those fault lines include sport. I think we've seen that sport access to sport is not equal, depending on your gender, for example, ability, socioeconomic background, race, and et cetera, et cetera. And so the playing field isn't equal. And there's a lot more, I agree, we can do to ensure that the most vulnerable, the most marginalized actually are able to fulfill the right to play sport. It's a fundamental right that many people cannot access. And I think COVID and the pandemic has exposed the inequities, the disparities within sport. And it's something I think we need to take more seriously as a sport for development sector, if we want to sort of increase our impact. Great. Okay. So my sort of, I guess, final question for the three panelists, and then we'll see if there's any questions or input from the audience, is sort of looking forward now. I mean, it's great to see such adaptation and innovation, I mean, from organizations, your networks that you're involved in, blended learning models, online, offline, adapting to circumstances, serving immediate needs. But moving forward, I mean, how do you view the future, you know, of your work in sport and development? I guess what are the sort of continuing challenges as you see, but also opportunities moving forward? And I guess finally, what advice would you give to any sort of young people and youth groups or networks in sport and development that are possibly facing similar challenges to those that you are? So I had listed Warren here, but I think we'll go to Maggie first, given that Warren's just given us an intro. So Maggie, maybe your thoughts on that quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the future of work as it relates to sport and development, I touched on a lot of it with Warren's comments and yours as well, Ben. I think understanding the balance of virtual and in person and the benefits and some of the negativity to both sides and the balance, right? So I think the future is, we've learned a lot about virtual and how great that is, because, you know, it breaks down some barriers around like location. I think an example is I was able to attend a conference that I normally wouldn't be able to because of cost and location. And this year, those two things were eliminated. However, as you know, Warren and all of us have already alluded to, is, you know, some people don't have access to the technology and the infrastructure to have access to some of those virtual resources. And some people just need to be able to go down the street to their community center and access services that way, right? So I think we need to, in the future, remember that we need a combination of both, I think. And so, you know, looking at challenges, I think, out of this, and I like to do challenges first so we can finish off with opportunities, but, you know, I think there's so much value in the face-to-face in-person sport that I personally still just don't think can be captured virtually, that we really need to get back to and make sure that is important. I think breaking some habits that might have been created out of this time as it relates to physical activity, and we need to make sure that this is addressed through sport and development as you know, more solutions are coming out of the pandemic. And then again, Ashita, around this virtual, while I think it's a great opportunity, we just need to be of keeping this focus, because it is a barrier to those who have and to those who do not have, and we just need to be really careful with that. in terms of opportunities, I think some of our greatest innovations have come out of times of challenge and global crisis. So I'm really looking forward to seeing, and I think we probably already have seen lots over the last 8 to 10 months of some of the innovations and things that have come out of this time. I think some of the forced changes to our industry that have happened because of the pandemic that actually are positive in nature and are there to stay for the future is a really great opportunity to take advantage of. And then I think the last opportunity is, and again, we've all kind of touched on this, right, is the realization of the things that are important to the core in terms of those necessities, right? Like we've all kind of been stripped down to some of the basics and importance in living in society. And I think that's been an important realization and awakening for a lot of us. And then lastly, before I flip it over to one of the other two, is advice for youth. And this was something that I heard that really resonated with me, and it's probably because I am youth and it's applicable to me, but is, these phrases around, youth are so full of potential and they have a bright future. Well, I don't disagree with these statements, and I don't want to discredit what they have. It's not, don't discredit what those people and youth have to bring to the table now. I think a good example is look at Greta Thunberg, and her impact that she's had on climate change is a really good example, and just reminding youth and youth networks and groups that you have a voice now, you have a perspective right now that is different. Diversity in age is important, and what you have to say now is important. What you will have to say in 10, 20, 30 years will also be valuable, but it won't be the same perspective. It will be from the same experiences and the same lens. And so I think it's important to have views and opinions at the table that include young people. So to remember that you don't have to be the CEO or the president or some fancy consultant and older and experienced, that, yeah, you have potential, but what you can bring to the table in terms of perspective is important now. And we're seeing that through the integration of youth in so many different ways now, and that realization. But that would be my advice to everyone out there right now.
Thanks, Maggie. Yeah, really, really important insights. Completely agree with you. People often say youth are the future, but youth are the present too, right? Youth have a role to play in society right now, not only when they're, older. And participatory youth engagement is critically important. I think you also touched on the digital divide, which Warren also touched on, that there is a digital divide. We need to be aware of the digital divide. But also there's inequities across that. But there are options for blended learning, as you said. So sessions can get delivered in person when it's safe to do so, and could be broadcast live. Those are options we can think about in the future. And really that the time for change is now. I think this is a time to reevaluate the role of sport in society. Elite sport stopped for some time and is still on hold in some places during the pandemic. But actually, many sport and development initiatives didn't stop. They continued doing virtual work. They continued reaching out to people. They played a role in the response efforts. And I think that's a reminder that sport is human. Sport is, and this hierarchy of sport we've built with elite sport at the top doesn't always necessarily serve the needs of everyone in society. So some fantastic insights. Thank you. Warren, I'll hand it over to you.
Ben, okay, so yes, challenges that have been brought on through this process, as mentioned before, quite insurmountable, but the future is definitely something I dream about every day. Like, I do try to stay present, but I'm always thinking about the future and how we can make a bigger impact, and how we can bring people closer together, even though we've got all of these challenges. So I am a firm believer in the advancement of technology. I love that we've got all of these platforms, and the potential, or rather the current opportunity at the moment, is to make education or sport development opportunities accessible via technology. There's a couple of ways to do this. We can literally appoint some people as brand ambassadors for our youth networks, or for our clubs. We could also upscale our social media, and I mean, social media doesn't have to just be something that we do when we have nothing else to do. It can really be purposeful. And using specific hashtags or specific tagging certain institutions can definitely help with getting sport development and peace initiatives noticed online. Oftentimes, some people may not have access to Wi-Fi or certain things, but some institutions or places do have free Wi-Fi, and most people do have phones. So it's in those moments that we need people to know a little bit more about what's happening within sport development and peace, and it's through those platforms. Specifically with education, a lot of us in sport development and peace work do come from scientific backgrounds or physiology backgrounds, and this is something that I quite enjoyed in the beginning of lockdown. I was offered the opportunity to design a return to gymnastics COVID-19 program and education and training seminar for all of our coaches across the country. And I think it was a very successful initiative. And that was one way I could teach our coaches out there who may not necessarily have gone to university or got any scientific qualifications, but they now do understand a little bit about the immune system and why exercise is so important to protect ourselves from the virus gaining a foothold onto our bodies and into our systems. And this was also quite effective with teaching young members of gymnastics and the sport world at large about the importance of physical activity, even during the pandemic while we were all at home. So those are some of the opportunities that I do see at the forefront. I do know that that gap is still present. So, I mean, I've been speaking to our local provincial government about making certain websites data free or data zero, because that is also one way we can make sure that people access online services or technology. And then I've got 3 anecdotes for our youth and for everybody that's in the room. And the first one is failure may not be required for success all the time, although failure does give a lot of context to success. It definitely does help us to learn a bit more about how to progress. So in this way, we need to try new things and we need to not be fearful of failing because we will definitely learn from those mistakes. I mean, it's the first time that any of us are in a pandemic such as this. So yeah, unless you were born in 1820 or 19, whenever. And then I wanted to end off with saying humility is teachability. We need to learn to ask for help because all of us in the sport development and peace sector, sometimes from where I'm standing as a youth member in the sector, I see some of us professionals being quite inaccessible. So it's one thing to encourage somebody to ask for help, but it's also another thing for us. We need to take more responsibility in affording that help and like letting people know that they can come to us, and then also being a part of their processes as well. The path to learning becomes easier and also less scary when we bridge those gaps. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Warren. Yeah, that's fantastic. And actually it reminds me of a session you led about mentoring on sport and development and the importance of that earlier this year. Completely agree with that. There's need to bridge divides between policy and practice as well. Learning from failure, critically important. It's something organizations don't want to talk about. Anything that hasn't worked in the private sector, they call it research and development. In the nonprofit sector, we avoid it. I think the use of technology, critical. I mean, platforms, networks, sharing of information, but it's not just about doing sessions online, it's sharing information, best practices, resources, tools. That's what the sportanddev.org tries to do, but that's what many platforms and networks do. So I'd actually encourage all the speakers maybe just to share any links to your organization or work in the chat so others can see that. And I think finally a point you made there, Warren, really good about sport and science, using a scientific approach, whether it's a sport science approach or it's a scientific approach to measuring the contribution of sport, right? And how important that is, that we can't just keep saying sport is good. We can't just keep saying sport is nice, sport has power. We need to evidence this, especially in a time of constrained resources when budgets for sport and development are actually often shrinking around the world. We need evidence more than ever. So some really great insights from your side. Ishita, your thoughts on the future of this work, your thoughts on any challenges and opportunities, and any further advice or suggestions you would have for any young people or youth networks and groups working in this area?
Right. You actually touched upon some of the challenges that I was going to mention, but I think a great challenge that I have faced and individuals in my network at the UNESCO network who are from developing countries have faced is getting people to see the value in investing in sports. For a country like mine, like India, you'd rather invest in nutrition or education because you can see direct results, right? But with sports, when it comes to monitoring and evaluation, it's not as easy, it's not as tangible. So I think that is a challenge we face as a sports for development organization. And in addition to that, we also face many challenges in terms of showing like impact assessment. Like, how are we creating impact? If you go to a school, you have an exam and you evaluate it, right? But here, we want to encourage participation and inclusivity. We don't necessarily want to have competition. We don't want people fighting to be number one. We want people to participate and participate in team sports, join communities. We want community participation. So I think that is a challenge I face. And the opportunities I see now is definitely with the pandemic, we've realized how much we can do online. We have access to so many resources, we have access to so many people. But like Maggie also said, when you're involved in sports, there's nothing like being on the pitch and playing. And I think that's very important for all of us. And another opportunity I see is that with this pandemic, I did realize that we had many parents call us and ask us, oh, when is your program starting? My child is feeling restless at home, really wants to go out and play. And I don't think they called up a teacher in school and said the same thing, because from a sports program, the enthusiasm and the involvement and activity is so much more. So I hope that was an eye-opener and people really missed going out there and playing sports. So maybe that's an opportunity where they see more value in it. And yeah, another opportunity is I personally, and a lot of people in my network, work a lot with gender equality. In many schools in India, girls are not allowed to play football, which is really surprising, right? The boys will get the full pitch, where the girls are just made to stay in a corner and play some sort of game where they're in a circle going around. So we want to change that, and we think this is the time, and since there's so much change happening, so much advocacy, we really want to work on gender equality. My message for other youth members would be to never stop learning and maybe take inspiration, like to name some pretty common people in football, like Marcus Rashford and his whole campaign for Zero Hunger, or Megan Rapinoe talking about the LGBTQ community. So I'd like for the youth to take inspiration from these amazing individuals who are doing so well in elite sports, but they still don't forget where they come from and are working so hard to give back to the community. So read, never stop learning, take inspiration, and yeah, that's my advice.
Thanks, Ishita. Yeah, that's really useful and valuable insights. I think, yeah, the challenges of showing impact in sport and development, or measuring impact, yeah, they're very well said, and that is necessary to show the value and viability of investments right in the first place. So I think there have been some good progress made around measuring the contribution of sport to the SDGs, led by the Commonwealth and others, but there's still a long way to go in terms of measuring sport, and it is complex, as you say. There are complexities with measuring sport and sport's contribution to development that don't exist in other fields. Point around gender equality is certainly well taken. I mean, we've seen that the pandemic can actually, well, has disproportionately affected girls and young women, and that's, you know, some gains that we've made, for example, in gender equity in sport may be reversed. And so it's quite clear that it's really important that that the fight for gender equity in and through sport continues, because there's still so much work to do. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting to note is you know, the sport for development sector, if we can call it a sector, is really, you know, in some ways a youth sector, and it's often what's very closely linked to youth. Often organizations employ young people as coaches or volunteers. They engage young people, but also the sector itself has only really been around for about 20 years, which means compared to more established sectors like public health, we are a young sector. We have a lot to learn, and we need to listen and engage more thoroughly. As you said, adopt participatory approaches and bring all voices into the conversation, which I think is critically important. Great. We have 5 minutes left. Thanks, Maggie, for sharing links. Warren and Ishita, if you want to share any links to your organizations, feel free to do so in the chat. There's 2 questions I see so far. The first one, and I'm just going to put it out there, and I guess just feel free to respond. They're not directed at anyone, but Sadiq Rahman asks, what would you suggest to unite people during a civil war or a long-lasting chaos by the government? I presume he means with the use of sport or sport for development initiative. We've seen a lot of chaos and a lot of instability with the COVID pandemic, but any quick thoughts from any of the panelists on Sadiq's question?
Hey, I will go first. I don't know much about civil war and long-lasting chaos, but I do know a lot about safe spaces or the creation of safe spaces. For example, in South Africa, we've got an organization called SADAG, which stands for the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. And they create safe spaces where groups would meet and they would unpack and discuss certain issues, certain feelings, and become unified, mutual issues, and then also mutual positive things that come out of that. So I think that's one way we can create unity. I'm not sure how well that would fare in civil war, because I know civil war is probably like, it's hectic. I actually don't even have an adjective to describe civil war. But it's one way for us to touch base with each other and to check in with each other and to show support of each other. And I think that if we're specifically talking about youth, it's also an important space to have to unpack other issues, such as adolescent type issues surrounding sexuality, issues surrounding inadequacy or racial segregation, and then the lack of opportunities. And people's feelings about these issues are valid. And that's something that the facilitator who creates the space needs to understand. And there should probably be a preamble that says anything that gets said in the space is valid, it's true, it's your perspective, and we respect that. Because oftentimes when youth are speaking, that is, whatever youth say in those moments gets kind of like overlooked and discombobulated amongst other things. And sometimes we come off as people who have frivolous ideas and that we walk around with. And these spaces are important for us. And I think that can bring about unity.
Great, thanks. Any thoughts, Maggie or Ishita, before we go for it, Ishita?
I'm going to do a little research, but Sadiq, your question is really interesting because there's this series called This is Football, and they spoke about an actual incident that happened in some part in Africa where a civil war was sort of curtailed and stopped because of a football match, where 2 states that were fighting came together, and because of football, they united. So I'm just going to search for that episode and link it after this conversation. And in addition to that, I'd also talk about encouraging civic and community participation through sports, especially through team sports, to have healthy competitions at a grassroots and local level. I feel that really helps in bringing communities together, because when you're on a football field, everybody is equal. If you're on the team with someone, they don't care if you have different political views. They'll still pass the ball to you if you can score a goal, right? And I think that's what appeals to me a lot about team sports, that once you're in a team, you have just one goal. And I think sports really has the power to make long-lasting positive transformations. I'm going to go search for that link now for you, Sadiq. It's a very interesting episode.
Thanks, Ishita. I mean, I know there's the example of Didier Drogba in the Ivory Coast.
Yeah, yes, that as well.
He helped to and the Olympic truce, which has happened before in countries. Sport's also been used now.
I'll share that as well.
Increasingly as a tool to prevent violent extremism, which is an issue as well. Maggie, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Sadiq, thank you for the powerful question. Like, it's a great question, and I don't want to speak out of the scope of what I can contribute to the question, but I think the very famous quote around sport speaks to youth in a language they understand. And when you asked this question and I was giving it some thought, one of the things I was thinking about was if people are familiar with the organization Right to Play and the actual story behind how that came about. And it kind of reminds me of this question relates to it, and their experience was they came to a struggling community with sports equipment, and when they got there, their first thoughts were, we're not hitting the mark, we should have brought, they need basic necessities here, and that's kind of what they need. And the community back to them and said, this is one of the first times someone's come to our community and hasn't looked at us as though in that way, and they've brought sport, and you've brought, you put some of those issues aside, enable us to just think about something else. And so I think sport is a really good tool, and I know it's been for me in my life, to park some of the other things happening that are challenging and unite people and give them a space to be happy and play with one another, and sometimes park some of the issues and other things that are happening. So that would just kind of be what my contribution to your question is.
Thanks. Yeah, and I mean, part of the idea of the Olympic truce is to actually broker peace so that conflict resolution can be achieved in the long run, right? So to create a space for dialogue, as you say. I'm aware we're coming to the end, but we've got one more question, which I think would be really useful to get people's views on. My colleague Paul Hunt has said, Maggie, you made important comments about the need to bring the views of young people to the table. Actually, you all did. And there are too few young people in leadership and board roles, despite the fact that most sport for development organizations often target young people, as their beneficiaries, as their coaches, as we've said. So any views on how we can sort of advocate for that to change and for young people to play more of a leadership role in organizations? And maybe if you could just, 1 minute, maybe 1 minute each, and then we'll wrap up the session. I know we could go on about this, but yeah. So any thoughts from any of you?
I can quickly start in 1 minute or less. I think the one thing, it's just being explicit about it. I think one of the things we've seen with that kind of boards, leadership committees is to address gender. There's a lot of explicit saying, we need to have a minimum of X amount of women on this board or these committees, and just being really explicit about it. So is there something we can do to address, we're talking on the subject of youth, but I think just ensuring those kinds of things are more diverse in opinions and just being really explicit about it is one option. Or, maybe it's not a board, but maybe you have a youth committee, right? Like that contribute, right? So there's some options, but I think naming it is a really important starting point.
Yeah, or creating a youth network like you guys have each done or each are a part of. Great. Ishita, any thoughts?
Very similar to Maggie's thoughts. I think it's important to maybe, this is why a lot of networks have an age cutoff, right? You need to be below 25 years at the time of applying, or you need to be 18 years, because I think it really helps. Like, people's experiences are different, and more than experiences, the way somebody looks at things, the perspective of the youth is very important, especially if we are creating programs for children and youth. And I think one of the ways on how we can advocate for this sort of change and how we can get more people on board is to listen to their stories and to raise awareness on their stories. If we get stories from youth members, one thing we do with my organization is that we highlight impact stories. Like, there was this one story about a girl from a very conservative family where her family never thought that it was a girl's place to play sports, but she ended up being the only girl in a mixed gender team. And that, for all of us, that was like a huge opportunity and a story, and we heard her voice. So I think if we give youth a chance to let their stories be heard, we'll get a lot more people coming in on board as participants and as leaders.
Great, thank you. Warren, any final words?
Yes, sorry, I lost myself there for a second. Yes, I do have final words. I do see that within the sport development and peace sector that we actually spend more time talking about youth development than actually doing youth development, I think. And I think one of the reasons is that, I mean, we do have many youth development programs taking place, but one thing that I think we're missing is that we actually don't specify those youth development programs to the needs of those youth all the time. For example, like we might want to get youth to be more physically active, but if we really listen to the needs of those youth, maybe we can get an idea about what youth currently need. So in an earlier project that we did this year, straight after the conference on Heritage Day in South Africa, we had an engagement session with some of our less fortunate youth in the Cape Flats. And part of that was a hackathon. And that hackathon asked youth about what are the skills that they think that they need for their futures. And a lot of the youth mentioned that they need more life skills, they need more professional development skills, they need more opportunities to play. So from that, the Youth Networks for Sport Development and Peace will be creating programs targeting those specific needs for that specific set of youth. In that way, we will be able to get more youth voices heard and more purposeful programs alongside the other suggestions that Maggie and Ishita mentioned about purposefully putting youth in these leadership positions. And then also coupling all of that with some mentorship and ensuring that some of the youth needs are met through mentorship. If I know a movie director and I hear of a youth member that wants to learn about filmmaking, I'm going to pair those two people together so that the movie director can share and impart that knowledge. I think that's also one of the missing gaps that we have here.
Yeah, great. Completely agree. I think that's a really good point. And I think it's involving young people in all stages, right? So from it's designing programs, it's delivering programs, it's evaluating programs, it's involved in leadership and decision making. So I guess it's throughout that whole process, not only at the end point or halfway through. I think that's critically important. It's something we often talk about, but isn't necessarily always realized enough. And I think Maggie made a really good point here. I mean, you know, ideally we're talking about youth engagement today, but you know, representativity and diversity across the spectrum. So making sure persons with disabilities, there's gender balance, and people from different groups are represented, that sport is not exclusive, but inclusive as much as possible. And I think that's a key point that you all touched upon. Well, we've kind of run out of time, so I'm just going to wrap up quickly. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. I'd like to thank our three excellent panelists, Ishita joining us from India, Maggie from Canada, and Warren from South Africa, for taking the time and providing genuine insights into how we can ensure young people remain connected through sport during these challenging times. Really great insights and much to take away, I think, from this conversation. Thanks to the audience for your active engagement. Thanks to Generation Amazing for organizing this important festival. There's still a whole range of sessions coming up today and tomorrow. And I think finally, as our speaker said, the voices of young people are critical, and probably more critical than ever right now, and they need to be urgently heard at this time in our history. So with that, thank you for joining. Take care, and please do stay in touch. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ben, for everything, for hosting this.
Great. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thank you,
Bye.
team. See you guys soon. Bye.
See you, Maggie and Warren.